Yes, we're coming to the last part of the workshop, and this is the moment that I will give the microphone to Kevin Ashley, who is the chair of this LIBER roundtable panel session. I'll let him do the talking, so I give it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Inge. So I can ask my panelists, I hope they know who they are. I'm about to introduce them to you shortly, to come up here and take your places on the table here. While they're doing that, I'll just mention briefly, as Inge said, my name is Kevin Ashley. I'm director of the Digital Curation Centre in the UK. If you're not aware of what we do, we're funded as a national body there to support the management of digital materials, and more specifically the management and reuse of research data within UK universities. So we produce training materials, guidance, and although our focus, because our funding is in the UK, our focus is the UK, we do hope that much of what we do has wider applicability, and indeed a great deal of the guidance we produce is in collaboration with partners overseas to ensure that wider uptake. But less about me and more about our panel. We're going to try and consider and wrap up really the context of what we learned today, and indeed what our next steps might be. So begin with Wolfram Horstmann, who's now the Associate Director of Digital Library Programs and Information Technology at the Bodleian, I believe is correct, was previously the Chief Information Officer at the University of Bielefeld, and also been at the Universities of Göttingen and Köln, I believe. Lucas Costa, who I think must win the award, I think, for the longest job title I've come across here, the Library Systems Coordinator in the Library and Information Systems Department of the Electronic Systems Division of the University Library of Amsterdam. And by the time he's checked that, I'm not sure he has time to do anything else after confirming his job title each day, but Lucas, I'm sure you can correct, but previously worked both at the Royal Library in the Netherlands and at Anevi, amongst other institutions. And Wilma van Wezenbeek, now director at TU Delft, of the libraries there since August 2011. Background in material science and engineering, but also a career in scientific publishing. I think you worked 12 years in that area and 7 years in the library domain. So again, three quite different perspectives, I think, to bring to the issues of the library's role in research data management. So I'm going to be asking the panel some questions, but also going to be encouraging you to do any follow-up on that, but also trying to get your opinion on some of the issues we want to deal with. And I guess I'm going to begin by asking you to reflect back. We heard a few mentions today of research life cycles or life paths, of ways of decomposing the different stages that research data goes through. And we've seen illustrations of a few of them. All of us will presume that the library has more of a role in some of those stages than in others. And I wonder if I could ask each of you to your own opinion of which parts of those research life cycles should the library really try hard to take a role in, and which parts should the library really be stepping back from and saying, in the words of one of our speakers, that is somebody else's problem. Wolfram, would you like to begin on that particular?
That's fine. So, so the parts of the research life cycles libraries should engage in. Well, we did an interesting exercise over the last 2 years with the LIBER working group on research data, and we came up with 10 recommendations, and I can only recommend to look at the recommendations. I think they cover most of the research life cycle or life cycles that we saw today, but I think there is some emphasis, and one of the roles, definitely also we saw that today or heard that today, is training and advice. That is maybe a scalable thing to do at a university. a role, if you would ask me to pick one role that I wouldn't recommend to take over, then it's the actual active data management that is usually done by the researchers, and I am skeptical that even if we reskill our library workforce significantly, that we will be able actually to support that. I think that should be kept in the responsibility of the research groups themselves. But then at the end of the life cycle, in the area of publication, I see again a strong role for the libraries to mint identifiers or even to take over curatorial ownership for data where researchers actually leave the institution.
So, as I'm working with library systems, I have a perspective from other perspectives, so to speak. I have heard this term research lifecycle, but also someone called it the data lifecycle. And I thought that is focused too much on data, because I also see that there are differences in disciplines between how the researchers work. We've seen the example of the meteorological data. It starts with data collection, but there are also other kinds of research that do not start with data collection, but I think it was actually in the data lifecycle slide, it said conceiving or something like that.
Yeah, the conceptual.
You think about what I'm going to do. So, and this is something that libraries have traditionally been doing all along, because they give access to scholarly publications, the old-style traditional publications, articles that are, again, also results of research. And you may have noticed that I've asked a couple of questions about linking on that level, on the old traditional level of discovery and giving access to full text. How we can, on that level, link from an article that is a result of a research project to not only the data sets, but maybe more the research projects and information about that, which also is a way of supporting researchers in the beginning of this life cycle. I think there hasn't been too much attention there. The focus has been too much on linking data sets to the publication here, instead of having the broader context. If you look at the data management, then in my view, the storage of data isn't really very interesting. You can leave it to all kinds of dedicated parties. We have seen Zenodo, and there's Figshare, and even in the Netherlands we have, it was mentioned, DANS, etc., 3TU, etc. The most important thing that libraries can do, I'm not saying librarians, but libraries and archives maybe, is make the stuff findable, discoverable, so in a number of ways. And this may probably the
so I wanted,
we should do.
If I can just press you a little and follow up on that before we move on to Wilma. I mean, you mentioned there that there are other actors, Dance and Zenodo and Dryad and others, who can potentially deal with that storage and indeed on making the stuff available. But we know that some groups of researchers at least really find it difficult to know which system to choose. And I think from our researcher panel earlier on, that even being able to advise people on, for instance, whether or not Zenodo is an appropriate choice.
That's a very good point.
Is that something you see that could do? Okay. So Wilma.
So I'm a library director, so I'm not only responsible for the research data, of course, in the university. That's the topic of today, but I thought perhaps it was nice to bring it just one level higher. So the research life cycle is what we also use for our team that's working on research support. And research data services is a part of it. And what I think are two important words is that we are not working as a library in isolation in our university. We're part of a team of supporting services. So I think both for research support as a whole and research data services in specific, we should be aware that we work together with people from legal services. and from human resources even. So we're not isolated, and that's of course true for being a library in your institute, but also being part of your nation. So that's why we launched Research Data Netherlands, to be aware that we should be working together. So that's the other word, working together. And well, perhaps it's enough for now. Well, perhaps there's one thing I wanted to add, because you said also what we should not be doing, perhaps. And the idea of so it's this long tail data that's very long and very big, right? It's even perhaps more, I understood, than if you talk about big data. So shouldn't we, for instance, at Delft University, focus on some areas if you talk about research data, and then other institutes in the Netherlands, like DANS, but also other institutes, do the same, so that we together are covering the whole field. So isn't that the way forward? So really focus. That's.
No, I think that's useful, and I was very keen to two things you mentioned there that I think are worth as reminding ourselves. One, about the fact that the library is not working in isolation, as you say, and I think we heard that point again for a number of the speakers, that, and okay, it's unfair, I phrased this question as what can the library do, but we have to think of that in the context of what should the institution, what the university as a whole be doing to support its researchers, and what part can the library play in that, as you say, but working alongside the other professional groups, the research office, the IT department, records managers, people concerned with information management in general. And also I was intrigued by your phrase as well, describing this as a research data service, and that accentuates the idea that it's a service to researchers and a service to support them in what they're doing, whereas management somehow can imply a role in which you're interfering and perhaps even taking away creativity. Whereas in the end, what we're really trying to, the reason we're managing this data is to see it being reused, to see research not just done once and producing one set of data, but to see more research done, new and different research, along with the same data. So are there any other views from the audience on or do you agree or disagree with the panel about the roles that you have? Yeah?
Well, I must agree with what Wilma says. In our university, Ghent University, the library is part of the research department. And we think that is actually a good case, because we have to work closely together with research management as a whole in the university. And you see that a lot of functions that we have, that there's a lot of talks between the two departments, the library and research department, just to get a grip on what we have to do together and who's doing what.
Thanks, Inge. Before we go on, perhaps so I can get a sense and the panel can get a sense of the room. I mean, this is tagged onto a library conference and it's sponsored by library organisations, so my presumption must be most of you are library based. Perhaps the simplest question to ask is, how many of you are not librarians? Okay, a fair number. And of those, are you people who are not librarians but working in a library? How many of you are not librarians and don't work in a library? Okay, still a fair number then. Okay, so there is more of a mix then perhaps than I expected. So to move on then to the panel again, we heard something about researchers' needs and their expectations of, what do they expect the university to do for them? What do they expect some of the other actors in this process, the publishers and others, to do to help them? I'd like you to think about, are we well placed to meet those needs? And are the researchers' expectations of us reasonable ones? Or are there cases where perhaps we need to manage their expectations of what others can do for them? And I wonder if I might begin with you this time, Wilbur.
And, well, I started to wonder, the researchers panel, I think, also mentioned that we should be encouraging them to actually deposit the data. And when we heard later talks in the training, one of the, also Andrew referred to it, is that we should be trying to teach ourselves to be more confident, to be able to approach people, to be brave. I always say you have 3 skills that you need in a library. You have to be brave, you have to put the user central, and you have to actually do what you preach, what you say. Well, if you do that, you will probably manage a lot. And so I wondered about that, because I think it is essential. It's of course not the only thing they mentioned, but then later on I thought in the training parts, well, actually that's difficult for us, isn't it? So how do we cope with that?
To cope specifically with the training? You mean
To go out and encourage and be brave and approach and not wait. They asked us to do small-scale projects, not to start something big, but to start it small, not to wait till everything is developed, but just do it. That's a different type of approach than we normally used to, I think.
Yeah.
That's what they asked.
And that really comes back. Here is a room full of brave people. I can see the bravery in them now. You shouldn't doubt for 1 minute, I think, their courage.
Good.
But go away with that feeling. So, Lucas.
Well, I think there is a big kind of divide or gap between what researchers expect. As far as I think, researchers have no real expectations from libraries. I have been talking to a couple. No, that's true. I've been talking to a couple of researchers lately because I'm getting into this new area of research information in a broad sense, not only data management. And they just actually one of them at the University of Amsterdam said, I asked him, do you use our brand new discovery system? No, we use Google. And he said, I know that when I click on a full text link, I know that it goes through the library link resolver and the money that's paid by the library. Well, the subscriptions, but that's all. And if we want to work together, we just start a Mendeley group, and then we have everything there. So there is is the question what are researchers' expectations, or is the question should we provide as libraries or provide unexpected services to researchers?
Well, yes, it's both about their needs. What do they need us to do, and what are they expecting us to do? And sometimes that's the same thing, and sometimes it's different.
If they have other solutions out there provided by other institutions or whatever, or by themselves, should we as libraries actually step in or not? That's maybe a question to the audience, if I may be so bold.
I mean, to help you with, you say that they have no expectations, but actually, I made a note of 3 that came out of the session we had earlier today. And okay, I think this is, to be fair, that these are expectations they have of their university, and the library may or may not be the best people to help with this. So one is about assisting them with funder compliance. More and more research funders are beginning to put rules around the creation of data management plans or deposition of data in an approved repository. And these are the things that researchers are struggling with. They know there are rules they have to comply with. It's more and more rules, more of the time, and that's exactly what they hope their university will help them do, will help them achieve that compliance in the easiest form. Others talked about giving them, this is not so much dealing with their own data as helping them get at other people's data, giving them consistent access to data collections, giving them APIs as well as human readable interfaces. That's something definitely I think that the data custodians can help with, and helping them preserve the workflows that go with the data as well as the data itself, so that you can truly replicate the research process.
Well, that's all very well, but if I see the same thing with students or something. So if they don't expect anything, if they're used to libraries, you go there for books or something. You hear that all the time. Although I never see a book where I work. But if they're not used to other services that we provide or could provide, then they're not going to ask for it. So we could probably do much more, not in isolation, as you say, but with the larger community of the researchers themselves and the university, even internationally. Why stick with your own local institution? If researchers work internationally or based on subjects and disciplines.
Yeah. I mean, to pick up one point you mentioned earlier, one simple thing I'm sure that all of us could do, whether it's using CCAN or something else, is, as you say, researchers are typically finding stuff using Google. Perhaps we should make it easier for them to find not just the publications, but for the data to be discoverable when they use that. And that, I know that's definitely what was behind Research Data Australia's aim of a single data catalogue for all of Australia, was simply make the data appear where people are looking for it. So Wolfram, finally, if you can respond to that.
Yeah, the data discovery tool also ranked first in our analysis at Oxford, what has to be actually developed also for making the links between, you said it was discussed too much, I think it cannot be discussed too much, the links between publication and data. So, because data is a big problem, and unless you kind of tame the beast, yeah, and one of the strategies to tame the beast is actually to say, focus on those data that are underpinning publications. So I think that is an important point. But the question was a different one, and so I would like to make two short comments. One is, things are not always what they seem. So if researchers are asked what they want to have, they might give different answers. So for example, we did a survey in the JISC-funded Damaro project, and they said they do not need services from the libraries. But then when asked whether they want to have data storage, for example, offered for free, they said they would, they have things in their drawers, so there would already be 3 petabyte in the first year was announced for being uploaded by hundreds of researchers. And this was really a direct response, so this is not an extrapolated number. So that's an interesting observation. And the second observation is that I think researchers' expectations vary very widely with the subjects they come from, and particularly to the libraries. In a place like Oxford and the Bodleian libraries, for example, there is a strong expectation that actually everything that is produced, even digitally, is held by the Bodleian libraries. They simply say, well, when we finish the project, we give it to the Bodleian libraries and they will preserve it. And there is a very strong assumption that actually the libraries play the role in the humanities. And for example, the medical sciences, on the other hand, they think, well, we have our stuff, you know, what do the libraries do anyway for us?
Okay. That's interesting. Just a couple of questions I think we might ask the audience in a moment. But before that, do any of you have any other feelings about that issue of the researcher expectations and researcher needs? Yes. Just wait for the mic.
Yeah. I don't know if it's a researcher's expectation, but to make research data easier to find, you have to use consistent metadata. And I think researchers are always subjective about their data. And so they cannot be consistent and that's where the librarian can step in and be more objective in the description of the data. So it's easier to find for other people.
That's one quite specific role, and I think, yeah, that fits well with the types of skills that librarians already have, or indeed archivists or anybody else involved in that area. So, I thought perhaps before we move on to the next question, do a very unscientific replication of that study of Andrew Cox's that you mentioned about, in that case we did in the UK, looking at the preparedness of libraries. So how many of you here feel that you've already got any sort of research data management service going in your library? Whether it's basic or mature or something where you feel, yeah, so very small number, 4, 5, 6, something like that, 7. Well, yeah, because we've heard about the wonderful things that are happening at the RTU, but yeah. So again, and presumably most of the rest of you're here because you think you ought to have something, or you at least want to find out how important it is for you. So there's a long way to go in developing services. So another simple question, if you're going to be doing this, we heard Wolfram said an exercise they did in a project there found that there was 3 petabytes of data already sitting in researchers' desk drawers, on flash drives, on those piles of CDs that we saw Sarah mention earlier, waiting to go into university managed storage. That's one of the things we encourage at the DCC. We encourage people to do a simple exercise, an audit, to say, how big is the problem you've already got? How many of you know how much research data might be sitting in your institution, even to an order of magnitude? No, I'm not surprised. It's a pretty unfair question. It's such a simple question to ask, and it's very, very difficult to do the capacity planning to know how much, for instance, is it going to cost us to do this if you don't even know how big the problem is, if you don't know whether it's terabytes or petabytes, if you don't know if there are hundreds of data sets or thousands or millions, or just 5, perhaps. You know, it makes a difference. And actually finding out that it probably wasn't all that difficult for you to do, was it, Wolfram? No.
No, I think it was a simple online tool that was used.
Yeah. And it gives you, again, it's part of that helping you to be brave. It gives you confidence. When you have numbers like that, you can say, even if we don't like the answer, at least we know what the size of the problem is. I think that's worth doing.
And the response rate was high, just to mention. Yeah. It was interesting. So researchers seem to be interested in the topic.
Yeah. So it's a simple thing I'd encourage you all to do as a next step. It can help motivate others in the institution, the decision makers, to give you the resources you might need, because you can begin to scope the scale of the problem, even if you decide that it's not the university that in the long term is going to take care of it, because we know there are lots of other places that lots of this data might end up. Okay, a follow-up then to that issue about the researcher needs is that there are differing views, I believe, on how the extent to which one can provide a very generic set of services that suit all research domains, or the extent to which where you need support which, like that provided by the subject librarians, is specific to particular research needs. Do you need different services for the social scientists, for the materials scientists, for the humanities researchers? And I believe that's, in the EU, that's an approach you've taken by dividing that sort of support up. So I wonder if you could speak first, Wilma, about...
Yes, of course. When we started in 2008, we said, okay, we are lacking in the Netherlands is something like DANS is, for the social, for the alpha-gamma sciences, for the beta sciences. But that's actually a too broad definition. And we really, it's now 5 years ago, thought of where do we start then if we start such a search. So we had our 3 to-use centers of excellences. So we thought that's a good place to start, because these 3 groups are already working together, so they have the urge to share data together, because they're apparently working in the framework of their field in the Netherlands. And but it also was too broad. So we're focusing now far more on climate, on environmental data, because if the community has settled it pretty well, like in astronomy, then that's fine. So because the reason why we're doing this is because we want the scientific output, right, to be shared, so we come to new innovative ideas. And we need the transparency, so that the whole integrity issue, of course. So don't forget the goal there, somewhere, that's flying there on top. That's why we're doing all these things. So it's not that we want to safeguard our existence or something. No, we have a higher goal. So if it's done well by the community, fine. So if it's not done well with the community, and we know that, and it's a community that's really close by where our subject specialists are working in, then it's a good field to start with. So that was sort of our approach. And it's really, that's also why we said DANS and 3 to Data Center. It's wise to work together, because it's really specialist areas. And we're not covering everything, so we hope a lot of people actually join this group of Research Data Netherlands, so that there is one entry point for the researchers, for the user. They can start.
Okay, so you have found that need. I wanted then, we can go to Wolfram then next and about that the domain differences.
The domain differences.
And how much can you provide a single service that suits all research, and how much do you need to provide targeted support for different research areas because their data needs are different?
Yeah, well, I agree with the statement that was made earlier today that probably one of the great strengths of the library is that they have a subject system. So, for example, as compared to IT services, they usually don't have that in an institution. I'm not saying that you should compete, I'm agreeing completely, and we do that at Oxford as well, working very, very closely with IT services and research services. But I think that there is a strength of the libraries to actually support that subject specificity. We have to do a lot of reskilling in that area to actually make the subject librarians more aware of the requirements that are in the individual disciplines. Whether or not this is sufficient for actually tackling the challenge of the diversity of research data that are out there is a pretty open question, I think. I would agree that this immersive approach of the embedded librarians is a good way to start and to feel out how deep actually the waters are, and to get a feeling how deep you can get involved into research data management. But I would suggest to do that, but in parallel to focus actually on the aspects that are not so subject specific, which is discovery and training.
Yeah. Okay, so that's worth separating out. As you say, there are some areas that are definitely discipline neutral in a sense, and they're easier. Lucas?
Okay, so I'm not sure I'm the right person to, but I can say something. At the University of Amsterdam, we are at the moment, we don't have a working research data management service, but we have a proposal for a program which is supposed to be a joint venture between the library and academic affairs on the university level, who are about research, and then the Central University ICT department. So this points to a kind of division of labor in that sense that the technical infrastructure would be the domain of the ICT department, whether they build something themselves or maybe they will implement something that's available out there. On the other hand, there is already a shift in the roles of our subject librarians. They are becoming more prominent, and I think that's also, it's very good to have them, to give them a large role in this new area of research support. It still is within the library, but my personal view, which is not my library or university view, is that I think it would best to have all discipline-specific stuff move away from the center to where teaching and research is happening.
I'm intrigued. I mean, the point that Wolfram made about it is true that some IT services don't do that specialisation, but I'm aware that there are some universities at Leach where IT staff are often embedded within the research groups, essentially and often will come from those particular backgrounds to achieve the same ends, I think, as a subject librarian, that they can provide support that's tailored to what a particular research group needs, that builds a connection into the very generic service that IT has. But
in Amsterdam, we have this for teaching applications, teaching systems. There are especially decentralized IT people there, but not yet for the research, of course.
Yeah, if I may comment, I mean, this is, maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. So I agree that this approach is, I think you can find it in many places, that you have IT people that are actually located in the department, kind of an IT officer or so, which is, I think, a good approach, but they usually tend to do their own things, yeah, and they build their own infrastructure. So it's
can't possibly happen.
It's a nice, as an well, with a little bit of CIO experience. So, and the librarians, they have the more centralized approach, but they have a dialogue with the disciplines, an established dialogue, but not in the right area. So the truth is somewhere, I think, in the middle, between those two. So subject-itarians, I don't know. Yeah.
So I guess...
But for the, may I? But for, if you look at it from the perspective of the researcher, he or she should not worry about whether the services come from a library, from IT, or from what others. And I think that's the main challenge for us the coming years, to be able to tackle that.
Yeah, just to give them integrated support for managing research data, whether it comes helping with a grant proposal through to managing the content. I definitely agree. I mean, I think perhaps this is a bit, given what you've all said about the early stages that most of you are at in providing research data services, perhaps you don't have direct experience yet with whether it's straightforward to provide that range of supports to the disciplines. But I wonder whether there's one I think we could ask in it, and it fits in as well with how organisations and LIBER could help us support this in the future. One way we know that's been attractive in the UK to try and manage this is to think about consortial approaches, bringing together multiple universities to work together to provide discipline support. And indeed, that's the approach that's been taken at Delft in 3TU. Only a small number of universities are on the size and scale of Oxford, and therefore can contemplate being able to provide integrated support to every single one of the disciplines that are there. And for many of the rest of us, the approaches taken at 3TU are within the White Rose group that we heard about earlier, where a group of university libraries and IT services can get together to say, collectively, we will support all of our researchers, but perhaps one institution will concentrate on particular areas of the sciences, another on the social sciences and humanities, perhaps. You can divide it up different ways. But if each of them agree to support all of the researchers, they can actually provide a better quality support. So how attractive is that to any of you? How, yeah?
So, Michael Elbeck from Technical University of Denmark. Because I've been worrying a bit about this, because we have a library which over the years, and this is something which happened at most of the university libraries in Denmark, has been centralized. We don't have any department libraries anymore. We don't have any subject specialists anymore. So what are our connections to the researchers out in the departments? So I'm just thinking maybe that's part of the answer to that, a solution to that, because we don't have that anymore. So we're worried that we, have no chance of actually getting in touch with the research.
Sorry, may I, Kevin, just answer? So the vision that we use in the 3TU Data Centrum is having data labs, having data archive, and having data services. Data labs is very specific, tailored to research groups. So there, whether it's somebody from the library or somebody from our eScience Center or what have you, but it's logical to have a data steward placed more or less within the group. Data archive, data services, you have then a split between what in data services, what you should do in a front office, in a direct way, approaching the researchers, and you have things that you should actually far better be sharing with a group, if you talk about training materials or archive facilities. So that's the steps you need to think about, I think.
Maybe you don't need the library in your case for managing research support, because there is
I would like to respond to that, because we've done a big information audit at university, and that's been managed by the IT, and they only been focusing on the security of data. So they only worried about, are you storing data in Dropbox, are you using Google, how do you make sure that it's not going into the wrong hands, that it doesn't disappear in that case. But they don't care about the dissemination, the sharing of data, reuse, and all these kind of things. They have they don't care about that at all. So, yeah, I think and that's where the library comes in.
Okay, well, that's an interesting point, because you say, I think you may well be right, many researchers don't care about reuse, but perhaps they would care more, and another role that we as institutions could have is to make them more aware of the very strong connection that's been shown in a number of disciplines between making your data available and getting your research cited. That's the sort of thing that motivates most researchers. And it also motivates the universities they work in. We all like to have research that's more widely cited. And there's solid evidence that's been done in disciplines as different from economics and cell array biology that shows this very strong link between having the data available and known to be available and linked to the publication and the fact that the research then gets more cited. So perhaps that's the way we can get them interested in reuse. So I wonder if I can come back to that issue then, just wrap it up about the sort of the collaboration, because I know collaboration can be a difficult thing to begin in universities, because in one sense we're competing with each other. We compete for the star researchers, we compete for students, we compete for research funding. And therefore finding a way to collaborate on things that are of collective interest can be quite difficult to do. It requires a bit of that bravery that Wilma referred to. But are there any others here that would see the potential, and perhaps organisations like LIBER helping you collaborate with your peers? Is that, or am I dreaming about something here? Perhaps not. Okay, we haven't really got the enthusiasm.
May I just was struck because, of course, the physical library, we haven't touched upon that, of course, at all today. And you always need online and offline together, so you need your visibility. So visualizing data, but also making visual in an offline environment, that's also a challenge we need to tackle, I think. See my point? And that's completely different, of course, from the traditional libraries we used to have in our departments. So it's something we are thinking also about in Delft, Netherlands, and of course abroad. And there was just recently, I saw in the CNI announced list, a new research library opened, I think. I'm trying to find the name. It was in the States, but yeah, okay, it's pretty big. Where they actually tackled that point. So how to create also an offline environment for the things we're doing. And that's not about books anymore. Yeah. So I thought that's...
Yep, okay. Inge.
I'm just thinking about a question on collaboration, because my feeling is indeed that it's not always easy to get universities to volunteer to collaborate on such things. Most of the time something is needed as a incentive coming from funding agencies that ask or demand a certain flow of how you work or how you disseminate things, and then it can happen. But I have the feeling voluntarily it's sometimes very difficult.
I mean, yeah, okay, Michael.
Michael Day from DCC, Bath. I was talking last week to some institutions trying to work together, and they have a lot of drivers. They have a collaboration agreement, they have all sorts of organizational ways of working together, but even though they have much the same technical infrastructure, they found it impossible to come up with some sort of idea of actually doing something concrete in this area, just because the cultural differences between the institutions, the way they actually use a repository, using the same software. So there's all these cultural impediments which make collaboration quite difficult in practice. So where it's been mostly successful is in terms of sharing things like training, professional training of the researchers across the different institutions, and those sort of more soft human side of things has been much easier to arrange rather than actually developing a shared service which would raise all sorts of questions about IT infrastructures and things.
Okay, I think that there's a few really interesting lessons coming out of that then about, as you said, Michael, about there are some things that are straightforward to collaborate on and some things where there are greater barriers, and perhaps so sharing, I think, some more knowledge about where is collaboration straightforward and where is it difficult and therefore you'll be foolish to attempt it, along with the sort of point that Inge made. How do you make the idea of collaboration more straightforward? And it seems that one way to do that might be even a little bit of research to do a write-up of the business case, perhaps behind the existing collaborations, like 3TU, like the White Rose, to help us understand, you know, what did those institutions save in cost terms by doing this? What did it cost them to do it? Or perhaps how much more rapidly were they able to do something as a result of that collaboration? And I think some concrete lessons, some measures that come out of that might help us make the case in our own institution to say, this is why the collaboration is worthwhile. And I think another example from a completely different area, I used to be involved in very large-scale data management, and I was really struck, this is 25 years ago, to realize that all the major oil companies who've been managing data on a very large scale for a long time, that comes out of seismic surveys, where they basically blow things up and measure how the ground behaves to try and work out where the oil and gas is. They have one big shared data repository for all that stuff. These are companies that in other respects are intensely competitive, but they realize there's no point competing over the data. You can only go in and blow things up once. People don't like you doing it more than once. So they share the raw data. They compete in how they analyze it. And they save a lot of money by having one big data store for all of that. And I was very struck that if the commercial world can identify reasons for collaboration like that in data management, then we really ought to be able to do it within universities. You know, that's, let's not persuade ourselves too much that we can't collaborate. Okay, so a shift then to another strand that we heard about today around the tools. So I've been really impressed by both the developments we heard about, Zenodo, but in particular the work that Joss Wynn was talking about with CCAN at Lincoln. And yet, it strikes me there that I suspect that's divided our audience a bit between people who look at something like that and say, that's really exciting, I want to try that out in my university, and other people who will look at it and say, that looks frightening and difficult and technical, and I hope nobody ever asks me to set anything up with that. So I wonder, and maybe there are other potential reactions as well, how does it feel within your institution on taking on, where you see an interesting tool like that? Is it easy to adopt these things, or do you think there are barriers? Begin with you, Will.
It's always tempting, I would say.
Yeah. Okay.
For example, CCAN and all these nice approaches. Probably you were mentioning the boundaries we actually have in capacity to do this, and even a large organization like Oxford has it, so we have to decide. And so we are currently on a Fedora, in a Fedora environment, and investing actually in a future Fedora's program. I don't know if you heard it. Look it up. It's very, very exciting, because we make it fit for research data, actually. But the other point that is maybe interesting with respect to tools is what are we talking about? Are we talking about actual file management, or are we talking about metadata management? I mean, we already established a little bit in the discussion the fact that that actually not everybody can do the file management probably. So, but a typical role is metadata, and I mean, who is the traditional partner in an institution who does metadata management at industrial scale? That is usually the libraries. So quite interesting is that, do we really have tools for research data, metadata management? Because we're mostly talking about file management. I'm just leaving this as an open question.
Well, I think there's a bit of both, but I'm just as interested as even if we have the tools, I think it's not always straightforward for an institution to say, that looks useful, therefore we will provide that to our researchers, because there are real costs in doing that. It's yet another thing that you have to manage. It's one thing to have an interesting research project show you, wow, you could do useful things with this. It's quite another to turn it into a service that you can embed and commit to, and not decide after a year that you've got to take it away, and therefore you'll disappoint all the researchers who've learned to use it. I think that's can be the hard problem.
And I think particularly in the area of research data management, this is a very, very important topic, because we are making implicit assertions that we're keeping the data.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that you asked this question. So this, you mentioned my job title. There is this division, Electronic Services, which will be renamed into Digital Services next week.
Yeah. Slightly shorter?
Big change, probably. But there is also another department in this division called the DPC, Digital Production Center, and they're actually already, they're more like developers. And there is currently a project, internal library electronic services project going on to implement Fedora as well for our institutional repository. So we're replacing the old system with Fedora. At the same time, and this is going to be interesting, we will try to integrate it as much as possible with our current research information system. You know Metis. As long as we still have that. So the idea is in this project, and now we work together with my department and the other department, which is also very interesting, internal collaboration. And it's going well now. This is live streamed, yes. And it's going quite well, I can say. The thing is that the idea is that the metadata, so this is not about research data, but about the other outputs, so the PDFs basically. So the idea is that the metadata for this research output will be, as it already is in the research information system. It will not be duplicated again, as we do now, to Fedora somewhere. So there will be an integration using APIs, linking data, hopefully somehow. So this will be an internal development. So we, and University of Amsterdam Library, we have the people who could probably do the same thing, but for research data. But as I mentioned before, there is this program that will be a cooperation with the Central University, so non-library, ICT, people, department, no, division, I don't know. It's organizational unit somehow. Mainly because of the huge size, probably, of the storage needed. But there might be a development possible that we will somehow.
But it sounds as if you do at least have the infrastructure internally to be able to take on tools like that when it's useful to do it.
I'm
even
not saying that we should. But
no, not every tool clearly, but it's possible for you to contemplate. It's not a frightening idea. So,
But I think we're also Fedora, so we're a Fedora panel. And it's Landora Drupal, it's the line that we use. And but I think that's tools more for us. So I would expect, if I see, I'm a conference and I would a few years ago have seen Mendeley for the first time, I would expect my library people to know about it and to know and understand what you can do with it, you know? Is that a sort of question you're asking us? Is that what you could expect library staff to be involved in?
Well,
what sort of tools the researchers actually use for either publishing or maintaining or sharing or what have you, your data?
Yeah,
so we should understand Dryad and Zenodo and what have you.
And I think there's an issue also, I think, in terms of the institution supporting the researcher. Yes, to some extent, I think you say that researchers will identify the tools that work for them in particular domains, and it's our job not to make it difficult for them to adopt them and to make it easy for their tools to fit into the wider workflow. But there are other cases where it helps for the institution to actually suggest to the researchers, here are things which actually it looks as if these could be good for you. Yeah. But I'm also conscious, one of the jobs we have at the Digital Curation Centre is identifying and describing these things. We've got a catalogue of something like 600 of these tools and resources, and I do wonder, how realistic is it for anybody to know about more than a handful of those and commit to supporting them, or even suggesting them? And our coverage isn't comprehensive.
So as long as all these tools are open and linked or linkable, then you can build kind of virtual.
And we share our knowledge base about it.
Yeah. Okay. Very briefly, Wolfgang, because I know we're beginning to run out of time. There's one more question I want to get to.
Tools is always, I always like this experience, to quote this experience we had in Bielefeld, to stress that tools are actually not important, because we did a study for 1.5 years on research requirements. That was for a CRIS system and repository, basically. And then we implemented the system together with Ghent and Lund, actually. The Kathmandu system will also be presented tomorrow. Within 2 months. Yeah. So, and that was really a very, very interesting exercise to see if you know what you need, the tools are actually absolutely not important.
2 months. That's quick.
Okay, that in some ways that's a positive message there. Okay, so one last question then to wrap up. So the event today has been sponsored, organised by LIBER and OpenAIRE, and one of the things they're keen to know to make sure that we actually get some lasting benefit from the workshop rather than just coming and sharing our problems and hearing about some interesting solutions. They'd like to know what they can do to help those of us who are here, to help our institutions move from the state we're in now, which for many of us is the very early stage, and some of us even before that early stage of a basic service. How can they help you establish or grow the research data services that you've got? What are the right actions for LIBER and OpenAIRE to take to assist you? So although I'll begin by asking the panel this, I think this is most definitely a question that's as much for all of you in this room as it is for the panel here, who almost by definition perhaps need that help just a little bit less than the rest of us. So Wilma, would you like to begin?
Well, of course, if you look back at the day, I think I made a remark on the training session. I think, and Elroy is here and referred to the Foster project, so that's of course coming up. I think we really working together and be sharing. So, and that should be because you asked the question here, what about these collaboration projects, and it was difficult to answer. So there should be, I think, an advice or tools or in place to help people actually to share best practices, to share their training services, to do perhaps much more than it already is in place. I think that might be, if I look back at the day, what comes as first in my mind.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yes, I have a very practical advice, I think. This is from my own perspective about linking from our discovery systems to all the other research output, data sets, and anything else we've seen presentations. So we saw something presented by Wiley about from the publisher perspective. So I think it's very important that international organizations like OpenAIRE, LIBER, and other the Digital Curation Center, and other similar bodies exercise pressure on the publishers to require researchers and authors to provide at least links to their data sets, but also preferably, from my point of view, to other information like research project information in such a way that it can be reused as a link to open data.
Yeah, I think
this is something that, as individual libraries, we can ask them, but you know, we're just one library, and if these groups like OpenAIRE, LIBER,
yeah, that's very practical. I know that very question is being asked in the UK at the moment. Researchers are beginning to ask, they've got requirements from their funders that there must be a link between their papers and the data that's behind it, and the data needs to be in a repository. And researchers are asking, is there a standard for how we embed that information? And quite separately, as you say, the problem is, even if we say, here is the standard for how you do it, because there are some already, the publishers all vary in their acceptance of it. Some journals will let you do it one way, some will insist you do it another way, some will refuse to allow it to be in there at all, some will, so there's a lot of work to do there. I think that's quite a practical thing which we can all collaborate on, and there'll be positive outcomes.
I just had, it occurred to me that I discussed with Fiona earlier over lunch, and there is a registry for data repositories. I wondered, is there also a registry for trusted data repositories? Because that might help.
Well, given that there's more than one way of deciding what's trusted, that is indeed
Yeah, okay,
one of the things that Preparedly is trying to deal with. So there's a number of research data registries of repositories, and some of them do also contain information such as whether a repository has met some type of accreditation standard. So there's the data seal of approval that Dan has administered. There was a track standard based around the work done by RLG and others, and there's an emerging ISO standard and an ISIN standard as well. So there's even collating that at the moment, I think, would be, and the World Data System has its own internal certification standard. So many to choose from, as there always is. Wolfram.
Well, I think it was already mentioned, the policy development is an interesting aspect for these organizations, specifically for LIBER, I think, but also, I mean, then in the European community context, OpenAIRE has already played, I think, a significant role in policy development. The second point is knowledge exchange. I think that, well, LIBER as an organization has this in his or her remit. Of course, OpenAIRE has established a network of national contact points through Driver already. I think also this is quite an astonishing achievement, covering all Europe and building kind of a human infrastructure for knowledge exchange and getting policies and, this is my third point, standards actually in place. Maybe not developing standards themselves, but enabling the institutions to implement standards just by communicating it, or also by providing guidelines how to implement them. So these 3 points.
Okay, so some work on standards as well there, and knowledge exchange, yeah. So there's some very concrete ones there. So any other thoughts on the floor as to what LIBER and OpenAIRE could be doing for us to make our lives easier? None at all. So you can all go away and do this yourselves now. Right, I'm glad. One more.
Hi, this is Izaskun Lacunza. I'm from LIBER, so I don't know if I am the right person to answer this question, but it's just a reflection on what LIBER is actually doing and how we think we are supporting libraries in Europe. I completely agree with Wolfram. The knowledge exchange that LIBER provides along Europe is huge. Actually, the 10 recommendations, the report about the 10 recommendations on how to start in research data is one of the most downloaded reports that we have in the web, showing that really people are expecting from LIBER some kind of guidance. We have steering committees, very well-learned steering committees, and I believe that it can be of help for libraries that are just starting in research data management or whatever. That is one of the roles that I see LIBER playing in Europe, and absolutely policy development. Together with COAR and OpenAIRE, we have been answering to so the Commission is right now designing how they see the research data framework/infrastructure in Europe, and we are stakeholders there. Libraries are stakeholders in that infrastructure. And it's really good that LIBER, together with COAR and OpenAIRE and such, are there informing the Commission and raising the voice of the libraries, making sure that that research data infrastructure is going to be built with the libraries.
Yes, I'm wondering if it would be possible to help develop the curriculum for future students of library information science schools around Europe and beyond. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and I know other organisations are working on that as well, so it'd be good. There's a project called DigCurve that's been doing that, and an international one involving people in the US around that idea of a curation curriculum. But I think, yes, absolutely worth working. Okay, very brief.
It's a very brief one. Through LIBER and OpenAIRE, we can make sure that the library voice or the voice of research institutions can be heard when we work together on this. And that's also very important to policy development.
Okay, thanks very much. And I'm sure if any other ideas occur to you that the organisers of this will be pleased to hear from you offline. But now, I'm conscious time is pressing. It's been a long day. There's been a lot to take in. And some people I know have to dash. But if we can just remain to thank our panel for their contributions and indeed the organisers for making the day possible.
Thank you, Kevin. Some final words before we rush off to the reception. I have a little gift for every speaker, so I'm just going to give that to them as a thank you for this day. I think indeed it was a long but very, very interesting day. So let me give you all a little present.
Oh, very nice.
Now for the ones in the room, what are they getting? It's a typical Ghent sweet, yeah, for you. Cuperdon. Don't ask me anything more of it. It's like a little nose, a pyramid form, and I hope you all like it. Here you are. So. And, well, I hope you enjoyed the reception. And for the people coming to the conference tomorrow, we start at 10 o'clock. Thank you. Lars, here you are. Did I forget anyone?